Hello there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well, though I certainly understand if many of you are not, because I am not particularly doing that great either. As I sit down to record this video, it has been about a week since the 2024 election, a little bit over, and I have been trying this past week to figure out where I'm going and what I want to say and what I want to do going forward, given the situation that we're now in, as we sort of look forward to a very clearly fascist government coming to the United States, one that in particular for me has been very targeted towards trans people, trans women specifically like myself, and what that means for me going forward in numerous different directions, both as a creator here on YouTube, but more especially, and what I want to talk to about in this video, what it means for the culture and situation and crisis for trans people going forward. And what's been difficult about dealing with that and thinking about that this past week is that anytime I sit down to try to think about one aspect of this, to like really hone in on like, okay, let's think about this part of the situation of the fallout from the election or what I have to look forward to in Trump's policies. And it just connects to 50 billion other fears and worries and concerns that it's just hard to pick a track. And I have been trying to sit down and write videos because that's how I sort of process emotions and also feel like I'm doing something constructive for my main channel, write some essays or things like that. And it's just been difficult because it's hard to just stay on one thought and think about one thought. It's hard for me in the best of times because of my very neurodivergent brain makes me connect things to 50 billion other things at any given time. But in this situation specifically, there's just so much entangled up in all of this, not just for trans people, but so many others, but especially for trans people at the moment, that it's just difficult for me to articulate. So I wanted to take this video here to try to just talk through a lot of the things that I have been feeling and experiencing as a trans person. I can't speak for the entire trans community, but my specific experience, and hopefully to connect with many others and explain to others of you who are not trans what at least a trans person might be feeling in this moment and what we're kind of wrestling with and trying to think about at this moment. So this video is going to be a little bit of a ramble. Hopefully it will be kind of concise. I've taken notes, which is something I usually don't do for a video like this, but I want to at least kind of keep some level of train of thought. But we're just going to kind of go through everything, and I'm just going to talk it out, and I reserve the right to be able to talk about these in more detail or with more specificity going forward, either on this channel or over on my main channel. But for right now, I think just the best thing for me, and maybe for all of you, hopefully, is just to kind of express it all and see what everyone's feeling and where we want to go as a community talking about these things. So please, in the comments as we get into this video, I know this is a big preamble, please respond to any or all of these things and let me know what you kind of want me to talk about going forward, because I think there's a lot of things that I'm struggling with. And I'll end on where I kind of want to go at the end of this video. But let's start off with in a weird place, because it's certainly not the most pressing thing that I want to talk about, but it is one that I think creates an interesting starting point for us. Because one of the weirdest things for me coming out of the election, looking at, the analyses of it, and we'll get to like all the Democrats' response of wanting to go further to the right and saying that it was the far left's fault and it was standing up for trans people's fault. We'll get there in a second. But weirdly, the spot for me that was fascinating was the fact, if you look at a lot of the demographics for people who voted for Trump this election, you saw that there was actually a very big increase in younger Gen Z white men voting for Trump. And it kind of ran counter to, I think, a lot of people's thoughts, which is, the younger generation is becoming more and more politically active, and even more so becoming more and more progressive. So to see this sort of large group of white men voting for Trump is kind of, I think, caused a lot of existential crisis for a lot of people, because, we want to think of this like, oh, hey, this gerontocracy running the country, and that certainly is a problem, but that we had this thought that like the youth will save us. We may have fucked things up, but the youth is coming up, and it will certainly get more and more progressive. And this election showed that that is not currently the direction that we're on. And when I saw that, it did surprise me, because it was just sort of like the thinking that I had. sort of generally, but, thinking about it more and more in my particular world that I've been living in for, just in my YouTube space, it's not shocking at all. I've been seeing, all of I'm a nerd. I talk about Star Trek and all the nerdy fun stuff on this channel. And I have been seeing and talking about over on my main channel this growing sense of aggrievement and anger and entitlement that has been growing in the nerd spheres, particularly in groups like, Critical Drinker, the YouTube channel Nerdrotic, and all those types of kind of, grifter, outrage merchant styles channels, and how they've been growing more and more in this sphere, partially based on YouTube's algorithm. But I think it also speaks to this messaging that has been getting through to a lot of young men of this sense of aggrievement and that there's this and that their masculinity is under attack, and that they have no recourse other than to sort of double down on masculinity and get angry at everybody who is seemingly taking away their space and what they were owed and what they wanted. I mean, like, just the political discourse is down to the fact that, in so many nerd spaces of like, oh, look, there's women in Star Wars, there's black people in Star Wars, oh, look, there's, trans surgery scars that you can put on your character in Dragon Age Veilguard. The seeming like inclusion of these things that have no detriment to the men themselves in any particular way, it just seeming as it's taking space from them in this culture that they are entitled to. And, that's very much in the gamer sphere and in the nerd spaces. But as we saw with Trump in his first election, way back in the day, with Breitbart and Bannon, how they took advantage of things like Gamergate to really galvanize that movement. And we've seen, I think it's become, frankly, the mainstream discourse on men. And what's frustrating for me about that is, and why I want to talk about it first, is because as a trans woman, it's a particular, especially as a white trans woman, it's a particular culture that, while I am not a part of, it's certainly one I am adjacent to and experienced when I was younger, as someone who was seen as a white dude growing up. And certainly I took a different direction with things, but it was just this, you just see the anger and disaffection that many young men are told to have, and how they're continually pushed to never see others as in solidarity with them or in a similar fight as them, and everything just becomes against them. And it's really frustrating because I, as a trans woman, have tried to do this work, and I think a lot of other trans women have tried to do this work for over years now. I mean, setting aside issues that I have with her and her perspective and some things that I know other people do, but look at Natalie Wynn, ContraPoints, who did a lot of that work to reach out to young radicalizing men at the time, way back in the day, and you see this connection that a lot of trans women were doing this de-radicalization work because we kind of understood this trauma of a culture of masculinity. And it's something that I even did on my main channel 2 years ago, when there was this discourse around the left doesn't do anything for men, and I made that sort of the myth of male socialization video on my main channel, and then the second follow-up video, the trauma of masculinity. And it's this work to try and talk to this idea is no, we do offer a lot to men, as a broad coalition, the leftist movement, in the sense that we are asking you to be in solidarity, to recognize that the problems that you are facing are very important, but also connected to so many others. We're all experiencing this pain, and our culture tries to tell men you should try to man up and join the matrix and be tougher and stronger and beat all down the other ones, and feel like you're in competition with everybody else. When in reality, no, we should be pushing this idea that we are all working together. But that's a story that doesn't get through. And it's what's really frustrating to me because, I'm seeing a lot of other creators struggle with it recently too. FD Signifier just recently did a video where he discussed, edgelord movies, and how a lot of people sort of point and laugh at people not understanding the Joker 2 or Starship Troopers, and pointing and saying oh, these movies are about fascism, and making fun of it, or making fun of this edgelordy culture of this toxic masculinity, and saying, hey, look, it's this is really shitty and these people should not be venerated, and how men will either get certain groups of men will get sort of react vitriolically at hearing that message, or they won't see it at all. And a lot of people, and they'll also react to people sort of laughing at this, sort of haha, you don't understand it, and feeling they fuck them. And again, this sense of aggrievement. And it's not this reaching out that we can do. to these men. But also it's very difficult because, how do you do that? We've done it over and over and over again, and the message doesn't get through, and there's this sort of overriding culture of hating men that they seem to be focused on and thinking about, when in reality I think there's a lot that we can offer that just isn't getting through. And it kind of makes me think about, and this is going to lead me into the rest of this discussion that I kind of want to get to, that is, how do we message this? And I think that's an existential crisis that I don't have an answer to, because, as at least just yet, and it's something I've been thinking about, and it's kind of the biggest thing that I've been thinking about recently, which is, what's the story that we're telling? Because I think what makes the right so effective, and why I think to a large degree they won this election, is that they speak to these senses of aggrievement and issues that people are facing. Trump speaks to the day-to-day issues that people are facing, the economic pressures that people are facing. The shitholes like Matt Walsh or Ben Shapiro or what have you, they do the same thing. They speak to what people are feeling, and what they offer is, it's the immigrants' fault, it's trans people's fault, it's the people coming for your kids, the very anti-Semitic conspiracy theory coded in different language. Like they offer up solutions that are horrific and awful and set people against each other. And that's the intention, to sort of create this culture of cruelty that fascism upholds by isolating people from each other. But it's a story nonetheless that is speaking to people's lived reality, despite the fact that fascism itself is the thing that is creating that lived reality. But they offer up solutions, and it's even if it's just lies and bigotry. And so I look at us as the left and sort of see how, for me, I've been speaking with a lot of this like highfalutin language or trying to, point at graphs and charts and studies to help people understand, and not necessarily always speaking to the emotion at the base and trying to offer that different story at an emotional level. Because while certainly facts don't care about your feelings, as Ben likes to say, the facts that you do care about are influenced by your feelings. And so that's sort of what I've been thinking about. And it's what I try to do on my channel and with my work, to try and speak to these emotions, to have these big emotional pieces that always connect these ideas to an emotion that I'm feeling. But I also know my autistic brain likes to over-explain things. And so I sometimes connect it in just like that way, with over-intellectualizing it. And so I'm just sort of thinking about, how do we tell that story? How do we tell that story? And how do we connect with people? And this brings me to my sort of second thought. It's in a very related way, is that, I think the reaction for a lot of establishment Democrats to this election has been to argue that they need to go further right. We're seeing a lot of establishment Democrats go, well, we need to go more to the center. We need to go more to the center. Democrats were speaking to the far left issues of trans people and men and women's sports, and not enough to the people's lived realities. And I think there's a kernel of truth there, but they're getting the idea completely wrong. Because again, the message that the moving to the center is not going to influence any more voters. It's not going to influence any more people to come to you, because you're just selling diet Republicanism. And Republicanism is going to just sell that idea way better. It just is. And so you look at Kamala Harris's campaign, and you just see that she just wasn't speaking to anybody realistically, even to the people who felt like, and myself included in this, who felt like, we'll vote for her just because she's the lesser of two evils, sort of thing. Which, even though we recognize how shitty she was, she wasn't exactly galvanizing us. I spoke on this very channel about how she was, not was willing to sort of rely on establishment thought on trans people. It's like, we'll just follow the law, when the law itself has been used to attack trans people for decades and centuries now in this country. And the Republicans are certainly wielding the law to attack trans people right now. And you see Democrat Senator Musi, who's from Massachusetts, certainly, and a few others, sort of having this message of Democrats were focusing on trans people, and I don't want biological men in women's sports either, and we should stop focusing on that and focus on the issues that real people face. And obviously, what he's doing there is making this argument to go further to the center, and tossing trans people on the fire to do so. And I've seen a lot of this sentiment too, even on my channel, where I've seen people leave comments saying, trans people are a losing issue, and we need to just stop focusing on trans people, throw them to the wolves, even if we need to. Some people even saying that explicitly, and focus on what we really want to focus on. I mean, I've seen, this is something that has been happening for a while now in leftist spaces, especially. You have the Young Turks, for example, Anna Kasparian, or even Cenk, even more so when he talks about trans women in sports, doing the same. over and over and over again. And it's just the wrong way of thinking about things, because I think what we need to be doing, it kind of goes to this idea of the story that we're selling here, is we need to be talking more towards people's lived reality, yes, but speaking about it in a way that inspires them and does so in spite of what the Republicans are saying or the assholes are saying. Because I've said this before, we continually focus on responding to the right, responding to what the right has to say. Oh, the right say, trans women or biological men, quote unquote, are dominating women's sports, so we need to debunk that, and allows the conversation to go there instead of having the real conversation that we need to be having and focusing the conversation on how do we make sports more inclusive? How do we make this in a way that celebrates the human body, the human spirit, the spirit of constructive competition that builds each other up and revels in the things that the human body can do and the joys of that in a way that is inclusive. And part of the reason that sports has become this galvanizing center for trans issues is because it's that idea of like competition, men versus women, us versus them, this biological essentialism of there's this version of womanhood that's usually based in some level of racism, hence why you see a lot of black women also getting ostracized from sports as well, alongside trans women generally, especially BIPOC trans women. So it's where all that stuff has been so normalized, but that ethos seeps into our entirety of the culture. So sports is sort of a galvanizing point because it is where they can easily create this culture of like, well, we can exclude trans women here because it makes common sense based on all the institutions, rules that we've set up of these ideas of men versus women, and then we can spread that out to the rest of the society. And so what we should be doing is speaking to like, no, how do we create structures? How do we create things that actually enable all of us to compete and celebrate each other in ways that maybe aren't seeing it as men versus women, or white versus black, or trans versus cis, but as a spectrum of humanity? And how do we do that in a way that is inclusive yet fair, and yet recognizes the spirit of competition of the game? But that's a conversation that requires the overhaul of all of our institutions, and no one really wants to think about that, especially in sports. But the Democrats don't want to have it as establishment members because they realize to do so would have to recognize the inherent problem of our entire institutions that are built on white supremacy. And so they're just not going to do that. And I do see some hopeful signs of like some Democrats like Bernie Sanders or AOC, who I have issues with. I don't think they're by any means perfect, but at least speaking to this idea of like, no, we need to actually move towards, having a more clear messaging to the working class and clear messaging across class solidarity, because, at the end of the day, it's true. No one does care about trans issues. And that's sad and frustrating for me to say in a very scary way, because at the end, and I'll actually speak to that more in just a second, but like at the end of the day, like no one really does care that much, but they do care about things that are going to affect them materially. And so if the offer is like, oh, it's trans people that are affecting your ability to pay your bills or your kids' education or what have you, that's what people are going to care about. But if we offer up this other idea of like, no, the reason is these billionaires taking money from you, trying to set things against you, and speak to that idea in solidarity with trans people and saying like trans people are experiencing these things probably more directly because they are targeted more, but you're experiencing the same thing they are. And how do we speak to that? Because white supremacy has this great idea of like it's a great story of like, there only comes order through hierarchy. So focus on getting yours, because if you don't get yours, someone else will take it from you. And instead we need to say, hey, uplifting all of ourselves helps us all. And that story, but how do we sell that story in a way that feels emotionally appealing? Because we haven't been selling it in an emotionally appealing way. And so I think seeing the Democrats shift that way has been frustrating, and we'll ultimately see where it comes down if the establishment Democrats will continue being further establishment, or if there will be this push for a new type of party within the system. At the end of the day, though, I don't particularly believe that this system is going to liberate us, but there is a sense of like, all right, can we create a coalition that actually starts pushing the conversation in that direction? I ultimately don't believe in the American system to ever protect us or liberate us. And maybe, that does mean that it just keeps on inevitably going towards fascism, and it keeps inevitably pulling towards that direction and just getting worse and worse and worse until it eventually falls apart. And we'll just see how many people die along the way and how horrible it's going to get for so many people before we get to that point where it all collapses, and how terrible it's going to be after the fact, because we have so shattered our communities that we don't have anybody around us that we feel connected to. And sort of that idea that capitalism types to sell, this Mad Maxian apocalypse that will come if we don't have the establishment to protect us, that everyone just be against each other. Maybe that'll be the direction that we head in, but I ultimately like to believe that we can create this push for more community, and maybe that'll come in coupling with a system that will try to push that way too, but ultimately at the end of the day, I don't think that's going to be our savior regardless. We need to start building in that direction and telling that story. And this kind of goes towards the element that I kind of want to talk to next before I get into the final point where I'm feeling as just a trans person specifically looking at the Trump administration, which is, kind of that idea where I said no one cares about trans people. And I think that cuts weirdly both ways, because this past weekend after the election, my fiance and I, we actually had to travel back to New York, where we're both from, or at least the East Coast, I should say, and to go to a wedding on her side of the family. I'm not going to share the details of all of that, but what I will say, because it's her family and hers to share, but it was kind of weird on multiple levels because we were both exhausted. I just lost my grandmother. She passed away last week on the night of the election. And we both were considering not going, but it was just sort of like, seeing she needed to see her family and things like that, because we're not going back for Christmas because we don't have the money to. And it was just really weird because we had expected us not to know the outcome of the election by the time we were at the wedding. We just expected to just sort of be there and be like, all right, we're going to be surrounded by these people, and sort of try and deal with our existential anxiety about it. But now we kind of knew where we were headed, and it was just so weird because, frankly, again, not speaking in specifics as her family, but her family is generally well off, much more well off than both of us are, which is a point of contention that that's an issue again with her family and how they've treated her and things like that. But regardless, presumably, we didn't talk politics there. I think most of those people, especially the older folks at that wedding, voted Republican. And it was just very weird because we were the only two trans women there. And for many of them, it was the first time meeting me after having proposed to her. And there was this utter fascination with me that I think comes with any, new member to a potential family. And they all wanted to meet me, talk to me, and the conversation kept being like, when's the wedding? Where are you honeymooning? And it was so weird because we had this air of politeness of like, oh yeah, we're looking forward to the wedding. We're going to maybe have it in this year, in 2026, maybe we'll honeymoon here. When inside, both of us were just feeling like, are we even going to be able to have a wedding? Can we even leave the country? Because there's so many things the Trump administration has pointed out that they're going to do, such as, assign, sort of make a mandate that says, like, sex is assigned at birth, and, we both have documents that say we're women, but we weren't assigned that at birth, so will that fuck up our ability to even leave the country? Will we become even more targets of attacks, even though we are lucky to live in California, a state, I have many issues with Gavin Newsom, but a state that seems to at least be trying to, do some nominal protections against the Trump administration, but how effective will that be? And like I said, we're lucky living in California. Many trans people don't have that privilege. So like, where are we going to be at this time? And it's kind of scary. But we had to hide all that in front of these people who also had these questions. I'm used to these types of questions, but it was just so weird given the culture of where we're in, where people are just asking, like, so you're trans, right? She's trans too. Your fiance, our family member. How does that work? And it was just these earnest questions of curiosity that I've had many times before, but it was so weird, that curiosity coming from people who I know voted for Trump. And just this like lack of inability to connect what they had done, what they had voted for, with my everyday reality. And there's part of me that wanted to get up and fucking scream in their faces, and say, hey, how dare you start asking me about my wedding and where we're gonna honeymoon, as if everything's fucking normal. That I get to have what you all get to have right now, that I'm at a wedding where all of you are celebrating this heteronormative couple coming together with and talking about Jesus and God and how it brings together love, and then acting as if that's going to be what I get to have. Not that I care about the Jesus part, but like acting as if like there's a world right now where that's going to feel normal. And I appreciated the, I guess, illusion in the room of treating me with that respect and treating me with that kindness. But you voted materially for me to not have that, regardless of whether you thought about that or not when you were doing it. And that's kind of rough, because it's not what they're thinking about, but it's what they did. It's what their reality is. And I think that that's the part because it gets back to that like story that we're selling, right? How do we propagandize to people to make them understand that, the things they voted for will not help them. And the things that they're voting for are going to harm the people that they aren't seeing or aren't even thinking about, because most people aren't really focused on trans issues. Yes, the Democrats, those who are polling right, understand that idea, but the idea isn't to toss trans people onto the fire. It's to try to explain better what trans people are dealing with, and connect that to everyday your struggle, what people's struggles are, to connect that sense of solidarity. But it's the conversation isn't really there because our culture isn't really set up for that. It's not set up for that conversation. And when I experience it in a room like that, I don't really, I can sense it. I can sense that these discussions would be helpful, but I don't know how to message that on a mass level. And I think the reason is that, it needs to come in your communities, it needs to come on local levels. I hope that my work here on YouTube and the things that I make are helpful towards creating those conversations within people, but that conversation needs to be pushed further. I am not going to be the liberation on this channel with the stuff that I make. All I can do, and this kind of gets into what I'm thinking about making, is all I can do is I think, I have been so burnt out the past few years trying to talk about trans issues every single day of this is the trans issue. Here's the thing that responding to the right and what the right's doing, making videos on Matt Walsh and what is a woman and all that nonsense jazz, J.K. Rowling. And I think what I think I'm going to be effective at doing and what I want to do and what I feel called to do is trying to make art and work that speaks to reminding ourselves that we are not trying to build a culture of cruelty. We're not trying to fight back against a culture of cruelty, though that is something we are going to be doing. We need to remind ourselves that we are fighting for a culture of love and caring and community and solidarity, and trying to figure out, it's going to take me time, but trying to figure out how to make that in a way that feels like it can speak to people across spectrums and speak to people to want to then go and make that in their everyday world, to not just leave it as hey, this is a nice warm feeling that you're feeling in a YouTube video or in a movie or whatever I get to make if I'm privileged enough, but it's a thing to make you feel like a call to action, try and make that live that in your everyday life, to take that dream in this world and make it part of the everyday. Kind of what FD Signify was talking about, what I've talked about a bunch with about Star Trek. I have many issues with Star Trek and its sort of neoliberal leanings, but this idea that there is a better future that we can make together by focusing on infinite diversity and infinite combinations, what I have tattooed on myself, that's the stories that we need more of, to remind ourselves of these cultures of caring and community that we can build. That will, yes, require fighting against cultures of cruelty, cultures of fascism, cultures of death and isolation and division, but building something better is what we need to be focusing on. And the last thing that I kind of want to focus on here, the last sort of thought, and thank you for indulging me all this ramble, is, where I sit in as a trans person, those are all nice, high-minded ideals that I have, but where I sit as a trans person living this reality, because, it's nice to say I want to do all of those things, but frankly, in a few different ways, I'm burnt out. I've been burnt out so much over the past few years, just by how much I've had to constantly work to grind to talk about these issues and talk about myself and try to get people to see my humanity and people not, and the transphobia that I've continually felt, not just from right-wing assholes, but this culture of division that I think infects so much of our ability as leftists to organize. Frankly, I see I see issues of, it's hard to talk about this. Maybe this isn't the right video to talk about it, but I see this issue creeping into leftist spaces of transphobia and things like that. Talking about, how there's been a lot of dudes that take over the conversation. And not hating on cis white dudes. Again, solidarity, but this conversation of we only talk about the things that focus on them. Earlier I was talking about there was this conversation about how leftism fails men. And there's this part of me that's yes, that's an important thing. We need to build that solidarity. We need to have that communication, but it's that always becomes the overriding conversation over any other conversation, over and over and over and over and over again. And it's how do I articulate myself in a way that we can talk about the issues that trans people are facing, or the issues that people of color are facing, because those also get deeply erased also in these larger conversations within leftist communities. And I've spoken to it earlier. I mean, how we often even set different groups against each other. One of the things that I saw that was honestly led me to fucking break down during the night before the election, because I was just getting attacked for it, was just this conversation around, I was voting for Kamala. though not with any joy. And there was this delegation of people that I understand, and I've spoken about this elsewhere, like I understand why they feel this way of like, she's supporting the genocide in Gaza. That is happening. And I have a red line on supporting her for that. And I get that. I understand that. There's a part of me that's like, vote for Kamala because less people will die under her administration than Trump's, particularly me as a trans woman where my rights are directly under attack. And she is not materially going to help Gaza any more than Trump is. So like, vote for her. That was my sort of point of view on that. But I understand people being like, fuck her, that's our red line. We can't support anyone, Trump or not, for, you know, the stuff happening in Palestine. And this continual failure of the Democrats, kind of speaking to what I was going before, to actually speak to that issue that people care about and seeing the death and seeing the destruction and what the emotions that we're feeling and our anger and vitriol and wanting to stop the just absolute destruction happening there. So I understand people's feelings on it. But what came out of that sort of discussion, when I'm sort of talking about like my feelings on voting for Kamala because of my position as a trans person and urging other people to do the same, because I didn't have this, I didn't see her being able to materially change it, like my vote materially going to harm or help Gaza in either way because Trump's not going to do much better. People coming and attacking me and saying, how dare you think about trans issues? Or, you know, I mentioned in a tweet, which is done because fuck Twitter. I'm leaving it, by the way, if you haven't heard. It's a place where it's intentionally trying to shape discourse in this very antagonistic way, where I talked about, you know, how I'm worried about the trans genocide that's going on, the attempted trans genocide going on here in the U.S. And elsewhere, like the U.K. And the conversation I got was like, how dare you talk about trans people being genocided as if it's the same as what's going on in Gaza. Which I don't even know how to quantify that, because like I even saw a lot of people being like, oh, you're just talking about an uptick in violence and anger towards trans people. How dare you compare it to Gaza? And I'm like, I'm not comparing the two. I'm saying they're both happening simultaneously. And we can talk about both, because what's happening to trans people right now is the early stage of a genocide. What's happening in Gaza is the end stages of decades of focused on creating a genocide. And the violence that is happening for decades towards Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank and other places throughout history, going all the way back to the formation of Israel and even before. And what we're seeing now is trans people in the early stages of that. And like those things happen simultaneously, and also considering trans people are not a consolidated like ethnic group, but one that spreads out multiple different groups. The way we are genocide is not going to look the same, but it is a genocide nonetheless, a cultural one, if anything. But trans people are dying too. You know, genocide does not always look like people being murdered, though, or like being shot with tanks or things like that. Though it does look like that, and it is fucking awful, and it's certainly much more pressing to a large degree given the danger that they're in. So I'm not saying that one is to be focused on more than the other. But it is one of those things where those aren't the same. Sometimes it looks like kids in a classroom being taught that these people shouldn't exist, or their culture being eliminated, or their history erased. That's not just a trans thing. That has happened to numerous groups throughout American history and history just generally. And so, yeah, it was depressing to me to see people who I understand why they have that red line on voting for Kamala and not wanting to do it, but seeing that conversation then be taken out into an attack on me and other trans people being like, how dare you set these two things against each other? You're being narcissistic. You're being self-centered. You're over worrying. You're a sellout. You're whatever you want to say. I could go on for hours. And it was really depressing and saddening. Not just because it was coming at me, though that abuse was not particularly fun, but was also saddening is like this inability to see how this erodes solidarity within our groups, and how this mindset is not one of our own, but it is the culture of white supremacy that is building this exact targeting, because it's creating this us versus them. And like, we can only focus on one thing. We can only do one thing. Different communities need to be against each other. We should only focus on ourselves. And it's like multiple things can happen at once. Multiple people can focus on different things at once, and we can find solidarity to work across them. But I don't know how to build that. And that's my biggest fear too, is that idea, the Republicans, the asshats, are always going to be there. They're always going to be the people that I'm going to fight. That hasn't changed. What concerns me more is this culture of transphobia that we are going to be entering into further and further and further. And that just seeping into the ability for us to organize. And so, like, I think it's even more behooves me and others to try to talk about this way that build the solidarity, have these conversations. But who do we center in that? And how we don't see it centering is even the wrong word. how do we make a fluid way to talk about these issues and have different, fronts and different groups that focus on it? Centering is the wrong word, because again, it implies one person that gets to have the center stage, and I don't think that's the way we should be thinking about it. So it's more of a question of like, how do we have that conversation? And that's where I'm kind of at a loss at the moment, and kind of where I'm going to be thinking about for a while. And then the last thing, I know I said the last thing a few times here, but the last thing I do really want to talk about here is, the fear as a trans person that I have. That's just going to be, I'm just going to take this moment to just focus on me for a second. And then I want to hear what other people are having to say beyond the trans community, kind of going to the idea that I had. But like, I know where I'm at, again, living in California, I have a little bit more privilege. Privilege even feels like the wrong word, but I guess it is privilege, because it's like privilege is the lack of having to face things. And there are trans people in red states who are going to face the brunt of this more directly and fiercely and more immediately. We've seen the crisis hotlines increase exponentially, and dear God, that is like, I'm sorry, I'm getting, it's been rough to see that, to see, on my videos, comments by people considering offing themselves. I won't say the word because YouTube's fucking censoring rules, but like, yeah, in my community. And that is, it's hard because I know what that feeling is like. I felt it numerous times. I felt self-hating. I felt scared. And I think this culture that's going to be growing is going to increase that feeling of self-hate, feeling of worthlessness, feeling that maybe you are a terrible person, both in our communities and outside of it. And that really scares me and sucks. And that culture really, really terrifies me. And then there's the material things of like, am I going to be able to marry my fiance? We have a plan for that. I'm not going to share it right now, but we have a plan for that just for our own joy, to have a little bit of joy in the moment. But then, is it worth staying in this country? Talk about staying and fighting, or do you go to protect yourself? Is my duty to stay and fight or not? And I think where I'm settling down is we're going to stay here, but we're updating our passports. And I think that's a scary thing. And will our passports mean anything if they do revert it back to, you need to go back to it at birth? And if that's the case, will that change in our documentation mean that we get stopped at a border somewhere if we have to flee or something? Will I be able to access hormones? We're sort of trying to stockpile hormones a little bit at the moment. And I know other trans people don't even have access to that, but like, are we going to be able to have health care? And I don't even say health care for like my own hormones, but like, will I get health care if I get sick? Because as the culture of transphobia increases, maybe California will be safe, but maybe I'll encounter a doctor who'll be like, hey, no, I don't want to treat you because you're trans, and let me die, or stay sick, or not get the medicine that I need. Because I have health issues that I don't talk about that like I need care for. And that happens to many trans people in red states, and women, cis women generally too, and many other minorities who just aren't helped in the same way and die because of it. And that's going to increase. And just under bigotry, not to mention the lack of like money. And speaking of money, like, for my own job, like trans people are going to be able to be discriminated against even more for any job whatsoever. But for my own job specifically, just speaking to myself, like as a YouTuber, like Trump or Project 2025 has stated that they wish to outlaw pornography, and label anything LGBTQ as pornography. And that's like all my content. So if just me appearing in a video as a public-facing trans person gets labeled as porn, and YouTube takes it down, as YouTube has already shown that they are willing to do it, like I talked about in another video, like me kissing my fiance was deemed sexual content in a video, and they've been willing to block it, and that hurts my ability to pay my bills, and that seems like it's only going to increase, and I may lose my channel altogether. How am I going to pay that? And then my skill set is like, I went to film school, and yeah, I think I'm a fairly good writer, and I think I've worked in journalism, but like, am I going to be able to work as a journalist? Am I going to be able to get a job in Hollywood that is continually already, even before this, not willing to actually prop up trans people or allow many minority people to actually have a voice? And whenever they do get a voice in something, it's usually just to speak about their own issues. And even if they get front-facing things, they're attacked endlessly by right-wing people that then the Hollywood acquiesces to try to not be political. Will I be able to get a job there? I don't know. Probably not. So then where does my skill set go? Will I be able to even get like a day-to-day job? I worked at a Starbucks for many years. Will I be able to? Because of discrimination? I don't know. And the housing market in California is certainly not cheap. Renting is certainly not, like, I have housing market as if I'm gonna ever own a fucking house. But rent, like, that's the fear that I have. And again, like, I have options that others don't. Many trans people don't, in the sense that, like, I do have YouTube. I do have some training as a college student. I am able to write. Like, maybe those avenues will be available to me. Maybe they'll be not. But there are some avenues that other trans people don't even have, who aren't even able to go to college, aren't even able to, get a job at a McDonald's or whatever. So, like, yeah, it's a terrifying moment on many levels as a trans person, of, like, what am I going to do? And I can sit here in some level of cope and be like, maybe it's all going to be fine. Maybe it'll be okay. And maybe to a degree, like, I'll be able to still do my YouTube. Maybe my voice will be even more heard because, it'll be a voice of resistance at a time where that is, very palatable to people. So maybe on this platform that values money, that voice will be more upheld because people will see it as that voice of resistance. So maybe that's the case. And maybe I'll be lucky in that sense. But I can't end up feeling that maybe that'll be a bunch of cope that I'm feeling. That's a bunch of cope that I'm feeling right now. And it's rose-tinted glasses towards a future that is very scary at the moment. Yeah, I don't know. Trying to end out on, I guess, some positive notes on this. Like, I've been sounding very nihilistic, and that's just where my mind is. But I do believe, ultimately, I said this in my main video, that things will get better. That, we may be entering a society that will be a society of cruelty more and more and more, but at the end of the day, we're all human. And no matter what happens, I do ultimately believe that the human heart will always survive. As long as humans survive, the human heart survives, no matter how much we try to kill it. And the truths that are within our heart of love and wanting kindness and connection and community will ultimately always win out. Because systems will ultimately come and go. They may hold on to power as long as they can, but they will eventually crumble, because cruelty and pain and authoritarianism is ultimately fragile and will eventually crumble. And I do believe that the human heart is stronger than all that, because humans will survive. Outside of climate change, which is its own existential crisis. But even then, I do believe that we will find community and caring and such. The only question is, how long will it take to get there? How dark will it get? And how many people will suffer and die? What scares me is that I will be one of those, and many of the people that I care about will be, and that it will be very, very long time before we leave that. But I do ultimately believe that it will happen. And so I think it's just my job to try to constantly hold on to that hope, remind ourselves of that hope, and fight for it in every way that I can, with every ability that I can, while also trying to make sure I don't burn out and die, and protect myself so I can protect others as best I can. So I think that that's ultimately the final kind of idea that I want to end on. It's not particularly focused, and I think that my next few years and months and whatever are going to be focused on trying to figure out how to make that sentiment that I just shared into a much more constructive target, rather than just thinking about the fears, trying to figure out how do we move forward. I think I don't have an answer to that just yet, and I think we're all going to be figuring it out. But I do ultimately think that that's the goal. As I said in my main video, the destination has not changed. The road just may be darker and harder than we imagined, but it has not changed in the slightest. So we'll get there. A lot to figure out, a lot to think about, but I think hopefully this video is me helping to articulate some of the things that we need to, I think, be thinking about and talking through, at least for me as a trans person. In all of this. But I don't know. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Anyways, as I always say, my friends, live long and prosper.